The German checkpoint appeared out of the morning fog like a scar across the road. A wooden barrier, two rifles. One bored-looking soldier was smoking a cigarette he was not supposed to enjoy. The French postman slowed his bicycle without being told. This road was part of his daily route. Same villages, same houses, same greetings. He had crossed this checkpoint dozens of times before, sometimes without stopping, sometimes with a glance at his papers. Routine protected him. Familiarity made him invisible, but not today. The soldier stepped forward and held out his hand. The postman stopped. The bicycle leaned slightly to the left, the leather mailbag shifting with its familiar weight. Inside were letters, censored, folded, stamped, officially approved. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, nothing written. The soldier did not ask for papers immediately. Instead, he looked at the man's face, not aggressively, not suspiciously, just long enough to notice small things. The stillness, the lack of urgency, the calm that felt practiced. "What village?" the soldier asked. The postman answered. The soldier nodded, then paused again. He tapped the mailbag with his knuckles, as if checking whether it sounded right. The postman felt the familiar pressure rise behind his eyes. Inside his head were words that could not exist on paper, names that could not be spoken aloud, instructions that had been repeated all morning silently, timed to the rhythm of pedaling and breath. If the soldier searched the bag, he would find nothing. If he searched the man, he would find nothing. And yet everything that mattered was there. The soldier flicked away his cigarette and lifted the barrier. "Go!" The postman pedaled forward, steady and controlled, until the checkpoint disappeared behind him. Only then did the thought return, the one he never allowed himself to finish. How long could a man carry messages no one could see, before one mistake erased them all? Under German occupation, nothing moved by accident. Roads were measured, villages counted, schedules recorded and revised. The occupation authorities believed deeply in systems and in their ability to control them. Paperwork was power. Stamps, permits, lists, and signatures formed an invisible net stretched across France. And yet, despite this control, information kept slipping through. Orders arrived too late. Raids found empty houses. Patrols missed meetings by minutes. Somewhere inside the machine, something was failing, quietly, consistently. The question was not whether the resistance existed. Everyone knew it did. The question was how it communicated at all. Letters were opened and resealed. Couriers vanished. Radios were tracked, triangulated, dismantled. The Germans were not careless. They were methodical, which made the contradiction unbearable. If messages were hunted so aggressively, how did they survive long enough to matter? The answer could not be written down. Anything written left a trace. Ink could be analyzed. Paper could be burned, reconstructed, or used as evidence. Even coded messages once found proved guilt. So the resistance adapted, not by becoming more complex, but by becoming simpler. They looked for people who already moved without suspicion. Milkmen, railway workers, delivery drivers, and postmen, whose postal workers occupied a strange space in occupied France. They were civilians, but essential. French, but tolerated. Watched, but trusted enough to keep the system running. Their routes crossed boundaries others could not. Their presence raised no questions, which raised a more dangerous one. What if the message never existed until it was spoken? A message memorized left no evidence. no paper trail, no object to confiscate. But it demanded something terrifying in return: absolute precision. A memorized message could not be checked, could not be corrected, could not be partially remembered. One wrong name, one misplaced time, one forgotten detail, and the entire network could collapse. Worse, it could collapse silently, without anyone knowing why. For the postman, this meant his own mind became the most dangerous place in occupied France. He could not write reminders. He could not rehearse aloud. He could not ask questions once the message was given. Every checkpoint became a test not of loyalty, but of memory. Every conversation risked contamination, a word overheard, a detail displaced. And still, the resistance chose this method, which brings us back to the mystery at the center of this story. Why would a movement built on secrecy place its survival inside the head of one ordinary man? And more unsettling still, why did that man agree? In occupied France, danger was not announced. It arrived quietly, wrapped in routine. Posters appeared overnight on stone walls, warnings printed in harsh black letters, announcing executions carried out at dawn. Names were listed without explanation. Sometimes the reason was sabotage. Sometimes it was simply for the maintenance of order. People learned not to ask which was worse. For civilians, survival depended on predictability. You left home at the same hour. You followed the same streets. You spoke to the same people in the same way. Any deviation, no matter how small, attracted attention. Postal workers were expected to embody this discipline. Their routes were approved by German authorities. Their delivery times are recorded. Their bicycles are registered. Even the weight of their mail bags was expected to remain consistent. A bag that was too heavy invited inspection. A bag that was too light raised questions. The postman understood this world intimately. He had learned which soldiers tolerated jokes and which demanded silence. He knew when to dismount before a checkpoint and when to pedal through slowly, eyes forward, shoulders relaxed. But memorizing resistance messages changed the meaning of every detail. A checkpoint was no longer just a delay. It was a countdown. A casual question was no longer small talk. It was an interrogation disguised as boredom. A friendly glance could turn into a calculation. What normally happened to people who failed was not secret. They were arrested without explanation. Homes were searched. Family members questioned. Sometimes the punishment stopped there. Often it did not. Interrogations were designed to exhaust, not to enlighten. Sleep deprivation, repetition. Silence was broken suddenly by violence. The goal was not truth, but compliance, and memory under pressure was unreliable. That was the greatest risk of all. If the postman were captured, the Germans would not need to find a letter. They would simply wait. Ask the same question again and again. Change the tone, change the room, change the hour. Eventually, something would surface. This is why most resistance networks avoided human memory as a method. It was too fragile, too human. Yet the conditions of occupation made other methods impossible. Paper betrayed people. Radios betrayed locations. Messengers betrayed routes. Memory, for all its risks, left nothing behind. For the postman, the stakes were absolute. He was not carrying one message for one day. He was becoming a moving archive, one that could not be locked, destroyed, or erased without destroying the man himself. Every morning, he mounted his bicycle knowing this. If he fell, if he hesitated, If he forgot, there would be no evidence of what he had done, only consequences. The postman did not begin by memorizing messages. At first, he noticed absences, letters that never arrived, addresses crossed out, then restored, people who waited at doors a little too long, as if expecting news that never came. Occupation had trained everyone to observe quietly. Survival depended on reading what was not said. The postman saw patterns because his work forced him to move through them every day. He delivered requisition notices and censored letters side by side, learning which kinds of paper brought fear and which brought relief. The resistance did not approach him directly. That would have been reckless. Instead, they let him see. A woman once asked him whether the road past the mill was still open. She already knew the answer. What she wanted to know was whether he knew it too. Another time, a man lingered after receiving his mail, asking about delivery times in the neighboring village, not casually, but precisely. These were not conversations. They were measurements. The postman learned to respond without commitment, short answers, neutral tone, no curiosity shown. That restraint mattered. It told those watching that he could be trusted to carry information without trying to own it. The discovery came when he realized something unsettling. The Germans never asked him what he knew. They asked where he was going. Why was it late? Why did he choose one road instead of another? Their attention was fixed on movement, not thought. A search was physical. An interrogation began with objects. Papers were unfolded. Bags were emptied. Pockets turned inside out. Once satisfied, the soldiers moved on. They did not consider that a man might carry something invisible, because invisibility did not fit their system. The resistance understood this weakness long before the occupiers did. When the first message was finally entrusted to him, it was delivered without ceremony. No explanation of its importance, no repetition, just a short series of facts spoken once, calmly, as if discussing the weather. The postman listened. He did not write anything down. He did not nod. He did not react. He memorized. Later, riding his route, he tested himself. He broke the message into pieces, tying each detail to something physical: a bend in the road, a farmhouse gate, the rhythm of pedaling uphill. Memory became landscape. By the time he reached the destination, the message felt less like information and more like muscle memory. He spoke it once, exactly once. Then he let it go. That was the discovery. Memory could be trained to behave like routine. And routine, in occupied France, was the safest disguise of all. The second message was different. Not longer, not more complex, just heavier. The first had been a warning, a shift in patrol timing, a road to avoid, useful but temporary. This one carried names, real ones, people who lived in houses he passed every week, people whose doors he knocked on with official letters that pretended nothing was wrong. Names changed everything, because names did not disappear once spoken. They stayed. They followed him. They attached themselves to faces, routines, and habits. Once memorized, they could not be treated like weather or road conditions. They were lives. The postman understood immediately what accepting this message meant. If he refused now, it would not be neutral. It would be noticed. The resistance did not force participation, but they measured reliability. Withdrawal at this stage created risk, for them and for him. This was the moral fracture. He could still deliver mail, and nothing more. He could claim ignorance and remain untouched by the deeper machinery of resistance. Or he could step fully into a role that required silence not just from others, but from himself. He chose the latter without ceremony. There was no speech, no declaration, just a nod, barely visible. From that moment, the postman was no longer carrying information incidentally. He was becoming a conduit. His mind was no longer his own. It was shared, temporarily, one with people he might never meet again. The weight of memorized names altered how he moved. Streets felt narrower. Familiar houses became fragile. Even routine greetings carried an edge, a reminder that what looked ordinary could be erased overnight. At checkpoints, he became aware of his own breathing. Too fast looked nervous. Too slow looked rehearsed. Calm had to be earned repeatedly, not assumed. He learned something else as well. Forgetting was as important as remembering. Once a message was delivered, it had to be destroyed immediately, not on paper, but internally. Repeating it, even silently, created risk. Memory could betray under pressure. The safest message was one that no longer existed. This discipline came at a cost. There were nights when he woke, convinced he had forgotten something essential. A name, a time, a place. Other nights, he dreamed of speaking aloud without realizing it, watched by faces he could not recognize. The first moral break did not announce itself with fear. It arrived as a responsibility, and responsibility, once accepted, did not allow retreat. As the occupation tightened, routine began to fray. Checkpoints multiplied along roads that had once been ignored. Soldiers who used to wave postmen through without a glance now asked questions that sounded casual but were carefully timed. Deliveries that once took hours stretched into full days. The postman felt the shift before anyone told him. Suspicion had a rhythm. It slowed conversations. It lengthened silences. It made soldiers look twice at things they had learned to ignore. The messages increased accordingly. What had once been occasional warnings became regular transmissions. Routes adjusted weekly. Safe houses moved. People disappeared and reappeared under different names. Each change demanded perfect recall. The danger was no longer singular. It was cumulative. Every memorized message left a residue. Even after deliberate forgetting, something lingered. Patterns formed. Associations built themselves without permission. The postman learned to compartmentalize his thoughts, dividing routes and information into separate mental spaces that did not touch. At checkpoints, the risk sharpened. Searches grew more thorough. Mailbags were emptied, letters spread on tables and examined one by one. Soldiers counted items, compared weights, and tested consistency. The postman stood still and let them work. He could not rush them. He could not watch too closely. Interest itself could be interpreted as guilt. Instead, he stared past the barrier, focusing on the next stretch of road, repeating neutral thoughts until the moment passed. Sometimes it nearly didn't. Once, a soldier asked him to repeat where he was going, after he had already answered. Another time, his papers were returned slowly, deliberately, out of order, as if testing whether he would correct the mistake. He did not. The repetition of danger changed him. Fear no longer arrived as panic. It became procedural. He learned how much attention to give it, enough to stay alert, not enough to break rhythm. But the system was not infinite. Neither was he. The resistance knew this. They shortened messages, reduced names, changed methods where possible. Still, the postman remained a central node, not because he was brave, but because he was still unseen. And invisibility, under occupation, was a resource that could not be replaced. The escalation was not a single event. It was the slow tightening of a net that never fully closed, until one day it almost did. It happened at a checkpoint that had not existed the week before. Fresh timber, newly driven posts, a temporary barrier dragged across the road as if assembled in haste, the kind of checkpoint built after someone had already failed to catch what they were looking for. The postman recognized the danger immediately. This was not a routine inspection. The soldiers were alert in a different way, less bored, more deliberate. One officer stood slightly apart, not watching vehicles, but watching people, faces, hands, breathing. The postman stopped when ordered. He handed over his papers. The officer did not look at them. Instead, he asked a question that should have been harmless. "Which villages are you delivering to today?" It was a question designed to fracture memory. The postman answered calmly, correctly. He named the route he had memorized years before the war, a route that existed whether messages did or not. The officer nodded, then asked him to repeat it. That was the moment. Not the question itself, but the silence that followed it. The pause, long enough to pull thoughts forward, to tempt correction, to make a man expose the effort behind his recall. Inside the postman's head, the memorized message pressed forward, uninvited. Names, times, a warning meant for someone waiting in a farmhouse 2 hours away. He did not suppress it. He let it pass through, untouched. He repeated the same villages, same order, same tone. The officer stepped closer, close enough to smell ink and dust and wool. Opened the bag. The letters were laid out on a table, counted, touched, lifted and dropped to test weight. The officer leafed through them slowly, as if the paper itself might confess. Then he did something unexpected. He picked up a random letter and asked the postman who it was for. The postman answered. The officer picked another answer, a third, a fourth. The test was not about the mail. It was about memory. The realization came all at once. They were not searching for written messages. They were searching for men who remembered too well. The officer's eyes sharpened. "How do you remember all this?" The postman hesitated, just long enough to seem human. "I've walked these routes for 20 years. It was not a lie. It was incomplete." The officer stared at him for several seconds, and the road behind them was silent. No vehicles, no witnesses. Then, abruptly, the officer waved his hand. "Go." No explanation, no accusation. The postman gathered his letters, returned them to the bag, and walked away without changing pace. Only when the checkpoint disappeared behind a bend in the road did the truth settle in. The system had been seen, not proven, not exposed, but noticed. And from that moment forward, the postman understood something with absolute clarity. If he continued, it would end only one way, not with arrest, but with recognition. The aftermath did not arrive with sirens or arrests. It arrived with an absence. 2 days after the checkpoint, one of the addresses on the postman's route no longer answered the door. The shutters were closed. The garden is untended. No smoke from the chimney, even in the cold morning hours. He delivered the letters anyway. He slid them through the slot as required. then stood for a moment longer than usual before moving on. By the end of the week, another house was empty. Then another. The changes were subtle, but the postman was trained to notice what others overlooked. A missing bicycle, a dog that no longer barked, curtains that never shifted. The resistance had heard the same thing he had heard at the checkpoint, not through words, but through pressure. Routes were changing. Messages were fewer. Some instructions were never sent at all, not because they were unimportant, because they were no longer safe. The postman did not ask questions. He understood his role too well. His task had never been to control events, only to move within them without disturbing their shape. He continued delivering mail. He continued memorizing nothing. When messages came, they came differently, shorter, fragmented, often carried by others now. Men and women less visible than a uniformed postman, less predictable. His usefulness had become a liability. German patrols increased briefly along his route, then thinned again. The checkpoint vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only wheel ruts and broken boards. No arrest ever came, no accusation, which was worse, because silence meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant he could not know whether he had been dismissed or merely delayed. The postman adapted by shrinking. He spoke less at checkpoints, avoided eye contact, walked slightly slower. He became exactly what the system expected, a tired man doing an old job badly. At home, he burned nothing. There was nothing to burn. At night, he slept lightly, waking at every sound, rehearsing answers he would never need to give. Once, weeks later, he passed a German officer on the road, the same man from the checkpoint. They recognized each other instantly. The officer did not stop him, did not nod, did not acknowledge him at all. That was the final message. The system had closed the fracture. By the spring of 1944, the postman was no longer part of any network. He delivered mail until the day Allied forces passed through the region and German units withdrew without ceremony. When liberation came, no one asked him what he had done during the war. No one thanked him. No one accused him. He returned to delivering letters in a country that pretended memory could be sorted and stamped like paper. And he allowed that illusion to stand, because what he had carried was never meant to be preserved. After the war, the postman kept his route. The uniforms changed. The checkpoints disappeared. The language on envelopes returned to ordinary things: invoices, condolences, wedding announcements, words that could be read without consequence. No one asked him what he had done between 1941 and 1944. That silence was not accidental. France rebuilt itself by choosing what to remember loudly and what to remember privately. Armed resistance had medals. Sabotage had monuments. Quiet compliance, quiet refusal, quiet improvisation. These did not translate easily into ceremony. A man who memorized words and carried them in his head left no evidence behind. There were no documents to archive, no witnesses who could safely testify, no moments dramatic enough to freeze into myth. The resistance network he had briefly served never recorded his name. It couldn't afford to. Compartmentalization had been survival. When parts were cut away, they were forgotten by design. Years later, some of the people whose messages passed through his memory survived. Others did not. He never knew which outcomes were linked to which words. He never tried to calculate it. That kind of accounting destroys people. In the 1950s, when officials began gathering testimonies, the postman was not contacted. He did not volunteer, not out of fear, but out of accuracy. He understood that what he had done could not be reconstructed without distortion. To explain it would require inventing intentions he never articulated, courage he never named, meaning he never paused to assign. He had acted because the system briefly allowed it, because the gap existed, because he was already there. He married late, had no children, continued walking the same roads until his knees forced him into early retirement. In the village, he was remembered as reliable, quiet, forgettable, which meant the system had worked. Once, decades later, a historian passed through asking about wartime routes, postal schedules, and civilian movement patterns. The postman answered factual questions politely and offered nothing else. When asked whether messages had ever been passed through the mail, he shrugged. Everyone carried something, he said. Most of it wasn't written. That was the closest he came to testimony. When he died, there was no obituary worth keeping, no line in a registry marking resistance service. His papers contained nothing unusual, only ordinary letters from an ordinary life. And that is where history leaves him, not because his actions were insignificant, but because they were deliberately constructed to vanish. The Nazi system collapsed under the armies, bombings, and supply failures, but inside it, smaller fractures had existed, moments where routine depended too heavily on assumption, where obedience relied on repetition rather than verification. The postman did not break the system. He moved through a weakness that he refused to acknowledge. And when that weakness closed, he stepped back into invisibility. No legacy claims him, but somewhere, lives continued on paths that should have ended earlier. Families existed that might not have. Absences never occurred because certain words arrived, intact and unspoken. That kind of legacy leaves no shape on paper. It survives only in the quiet truth that empires do not fall only to force. They also fail when ordinary people learn exactly how much silence they can carry without being noticed.